Welcome back to the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast, where we study authoritarian behavior around the world and try to distill lessons for anyone interested in the defense of freedom. I'm Ahmed Gatnash, and in this episode I talk with Iyad El-Baghdadi about a little noticed facet of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The fact that it has pushed a widening wedge between the Gulf monarchies of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and their Western allies.
لهم حديد ونار لهم حديد ونار وهم من القش أضعف.
Hey Iyad.
Hey Ahmed.
So we've been watching the Ukraine crisis unfold for the last month and seeing the crimes Russia's committing, but we've also been picking up on something quite unusual at the same time, which is the reaction of Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to the Ukraine invasion and how it's straining their relationship with the US in new and unusual ways, I think.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that we kind of predicted this a few months ago, mainly because of our disinformation monitoring. So I believe it was a few days before the actual invasion that we had put together a report. And of course, this report basically is private information, but we predicted that those two countries, and especially specifically Saudi Arabia, will use this as an opportunity to launch kind of an oil war. I don't want to call it. It's not really much of a war right now, but essentially use this situation for both economic leverage and political leverage. And this is exactly what we've seen happening. And we thought that this is worth a deep dive on the Arab Tyrant Manual because a lot of people have, I've seen it on my timeline on Twitter, for example. A lot of people are confused. They're like, wait, these countries are basically US proxies. And, like the US tells them to jump and they ask how high. What is happening now? And of course, a lot of this is based upon perceptions that people have had for a very long time. They haven't really updated. The times have changed. These countries have changed, and the world is changing. And so we thought that it's worth having a conversation about this.
Yeah, so to loop back for context, I'm not really sure how far back to go for context because you could start with the petrodollar system itself and the fact that for decades there's been this US-Saudi alliance in which Saudi Arabia and all of the Gulf countries price oil in dollars and basically sell that in exchange for both equipment and US guarantees of protection, military protection. And then there's this whole economic system in which they use the proceeds of that oil to invest in the US and buy US treasuries to prop up the US government to strengthen its military might and enable it to better protect them. But basically, the Russian war on Ukraine comes at a particularly precarious moment economically because the world's just getting over the coronavirus, lockdown policies and dealing with the fallout from that. And we're having really high inflation across the world. The price of everything is getting more expensive. And of course, energy is very directly connected to that because when the price of energy goes up, your price of transporting all goods goes up. So you see that, in the price of living. And this is causing some political tension in Western democracies. It's expected to get a lot worse before it gets better. And then all of a sudden, one of the largest energy producers in the world, Russia, abruptly declares war on a neighbor and invades. And in the light of that, the world's looking at what they can do to, fight back. And one of the major things is sanctions. And Russia has been sanctioned very heavily. But, there's a part of that which Europe is particularly unwilling to do, which is energy sanctions, because especially Germany is extremely dependent on Russian energy. So as you have Russia being heavily sanctioned, you have a lot of countries looking for where they can get their energy, alternative sources, and the price of energy spiking. And there was an article not too long ago which basically said that Joe Biden was, this is an article in Axios, and it said Biden's advisors were weighing a trip to Saudi Arabia in order to do some diplomacy and try to get concessions on oil supplies. And the basic idea here is that they're in an extraordinary situation. Russia's invasion has kind of scrambled everyone's foreign policies, and the US is having to reorder its priorities. And potentially even, a lot was made of the Biden administration's so-called emphasis on human rights. And suddenly they're scrambling to have calls with Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, talking about, possibly getting Venezuelan oil, talking about Saudi Arabia. And then something really strange happens, which is, whilst all this is happening, Saudi Arabia doesn't show any interest in actually going ahead with that and repairing relations.
I mean, let's take it a step back to before, before this crisis. I mean, what was the status quo before this crisis? As we know, Saudi Arabia is, an oil superpower. I mean, there are some countries which have such a big hold on the market, such a big portion of the market, that they're able to, of course, either by themselves or along with other, with other allies, they can stabilize the market. They can make the market go up or down. And Saudi Arabia has, for 40 years, has also been very skilled at this game. I mean, they know how to do it.
And it's also notable that, technically speaking, they're a swing producer, so they have a lot of capacity that they can turn on and off at short notice.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it's also that it's low-cost production. Unlike, for example, Venezuelan oil, which is per barrel more expensive to dig out in the first place. So as a result, the Saudis, have both the capacity, and they have they have the extra supply, and they have the capacity and the know-how to stabilize the markets. In the past, as you mentioned, in your introduction to the context, there was this agreement based upon this alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States and other Western countries, whereby Saudi Arabia would stabilize the markets on behalf of the world, but also on behalf of the West. And in return, Saudi Arabia, of course, had these security guarantees from the West. The idea is this is a mutual and kind of unconditional. I don't want to say unconditional. Nothing's really unconditional in politics, but it's kind of an institutional. Maybe institutional is the better word here. It's an institutional relationship whereby Saudi Arabia can always rely upon the West for security guarantees. The West, of course, being most importantly the United States. And the United States and the rest of the West can rely upon Saudi Arabia for stabilizing the oil supplies. Here is where things get weird, because this is, of course, a crisis. This is an energy crisis. And for the first time, you see the Gulf oil producers, instead of playing the normal role, which assumes that, you protect us and we're going to make sure that you're taken care of, they go a different way. And this is most important when you consider that it's not that the United States withdrew its security guarantees to the UAE or Saudi Arabia. I mean, it still has these security guarantees in place, and it still is very supportive of these countries, whether be it politically or militarily. And it still considers them, of course, strong and important allies. It is them, which, of course, we have to remind are the weaker part in this relationship. It's, of course, a relationship with a superpower, with the United States and with the West. It is them who decide to change this relationship, and the whole point of this conversation now is really exploring why and how and what are the consequences of that. Because this is such a, I mean, you hinted to this in your introduction, Ahmed, but because this is such a, this is a conversation that can be taken in any direction, I'm going to start by giving you very quickly my impression about why this is not a good idea from the point of view of, let's say, Saudi Arabia. Essentially, this is them. Especially, of course, Mohammed bin Salman is the main player here. I mean, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates is also going along with it. But it seems that Mohammed bin Salman, this is more sensitive for him. This is at least our analysis, even based upon disinformation analysis. But it seems that this trades off short-term gain, be it financial gain, keep in mind that, they are making more money, or political gain, political leverage on the short term. This is trading off short-term gains for long-term trouble. And in this particular, this kind of short-term thinking exemplifies this gambler mentality that these regimes have had over the past few years, unfortunately, especially the regime of Mohammed bin Salman. So this is what I think is really going to happen. And I'm going to be brief, but of course, brief as much as I can be, because this is such a deep topic. Most of the world's industrial nations, as a result of this oil crunch, are going to deepen investment into renewables. This is the lesson that a lot of countries in Europe are getting. I'm not sure about the United States as different context, but I think at least in Europe, the message that's coming is that we have to accelerate transition away from fossil fuels because we don't have our own fossil fuel supplies, and we have to transition out of fossil fuels anyway because green economy, climate crisis, etc. So this is going to compound. I mean, keep in mind, if I'm thinking in terms of if I am in Mohammed bin Salman's shoes, this is not good for me because this is going to compound upon existing calls to divest from fossil fuels in order to tackle the climate crisis, which means that this is probably the last time he can play this game, because the next time a big crisis comes along, the world would have already, significant portions of the world. I don't think the transition is going to be so sudden, but the game is going to get old after a while.
Now, the transition is already underway, so I think it's just going to accelerate from here to the extent where they become less and less important over time.
Exactly. And keep in mind, of course, this is strategic for some countries. It's not just a matter of, just another product. It's a matter of their national security. This is something I'll also touch upon.
I think that's most clearly exemplified by the situation Germany finds itself in today, that they've basically spent decades, at least a decade and a half, making themselves more and more dependent on Russia. The Nord Stream 1 pipeline, you have this relationship going back all the way to Gerhard Schroeder, the former German chancellor, who, after leaving office, went to work for, Russian oil and has a very close relationship with Putin.
It's rooted in this kind of idea that Germany had of engagement, changing the behavior of these closed regimes through engagement in trade and economic interdependence, which now we see doesn't really work. It doesn't really work not only because this is what dictators do, and they are basically, the dictatorships are crisis factories, but also because there is a geopolitical element about, the survival of the state or survival of the regime that cannot, a state would rather be poor than not exist, is what I'm saying.
So I think there's an interesting miscalculation that Western democracies often make, which is about rationality here, because the idea is basically, if we make our countries interdependent, then it would be irrational for either party to do something which would harm the other and therefore harm itself. And that's what Germany did by making itself interdependent with Russia. So it relies on Russia for its energy and Russia relies on it for money. Only Russia went ahead and did something incredibly self-destructive, which resulted in vast global sanctions, and which you wouldn't have expected a rational actor to carry out.
I've been kind of trying to understand Germany's logic here, and to be honest, some of the stuff I read has made some sense. From a socio-analytic or almost psychological analysis. Which is really the devastation that Germany really, like Nazi Germany, caused in Eastern Europe, and the number of Russian civilians that were devastated, areas of Russia that were depopulated, devastated because of German action. And we have to remember this isn't a very long time ago. This is still within living memory for a lot of people, and so part of this engagement through trade is really a German attitude that says that we don't want war again, and I understand it in that kind of context, in that kind of historical and socio-political context. But realities are something else, and we've talked about this many times on this podcast and outside of this podcast on our private Twitter accounts. Dictatorships cannot be reformed through trade. The more you strengthen them, the more they take it as permission. But let me move on to the next point the next consequence of this action by Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed. I sense that the main problem that's going to happen following this is that Western nations will learn that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not reliable partners for energy stability. This is big, in a sense that this is them becoming that means they're not an ally in the sense that they were in the past. So this relationship that used to be institutional is now, contested and kind of transactional. And for the West, that's fine because the West will survive. But for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have their own geopolitical unsustainabilities and instabilities, this is a very questionable, policy. For the US in particular, it's going to become increasingly difficult for any public figure in the United States, like a congressman, etc., to take pro-Saudi positions. This compounds upon the Khashoggi, the post-Khashoggi fallout, which has, of course, consequences for their PR. Also, arts and culture, sports, typical avenues of soft power. It's going to be really difficult for Saudi Arabia and maybe increasingly the United Arab Emirates as well to kind of have that kind of soft power within the UAE, at least publicly. But also, I think something that we didn't really talk about, and I think not many people have talked about, is for much of the West, of course, we live in Europe, me and you, and I live in Norway, a country which was occupied by the Nazis in World War II. It wasn't devastated; it's not as devastated as other countries, but even here, the real, the Second World War still has this long shadow that you feel. People actually feel that, we don't want war. We don't want to go there again. So this thing, there's a lot of disgust with Putin for dragging war into Europe and Europe into war again. And of course, not mentioning that, of course, there was war in the Balkans, for example, for a long time. But at least for Western Europe, there was this kind of peace dividend, they didn't really have to invest so much into their security. There was this assumption that, this is unthinkable. War in Europe is unthinkable. So I think that these dictators really did not understand and still do not understand the amount of resentment, absolute resentment that many people in the West are harboring against them because they're price gouging during a time of crisis. And this resentment is going to feed into the dynamics that we talked about, be it the investment, hastening investment into green energy, not considering them to be allies anymore, not kind of institutional allies, but, kind of, we give and take, and also their inability to build soft power.
So I want to come back to the idea you mentioned that the relationship has gone from unconditional to transactional, but I'm going to come back to it the long way, because I think the seeds of that actually happened in 2011. Until then, you had this very unconditional relationship because there were not many complicators in the relationship. The Arab world sold oil, the West gave it security. 2011, you have this massive complicator in the form of a massive grassroots pro-democracy movement, which gets crushed, and that puts the West in kind of a terrible position because it doesn't want to lose this relationship that it's had in terms of, political security, in terms of, a strategic alliance against extremist movements, in terms of energy security. But at the same time, it can't bring itself to, nakedly participate in the crushing of pro-democracy movements. And there are a lot of regimes, and I think Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the most prominent there, who this was a massive wake-up call. That they realized, the US is actually not unconditional in this. They won't help us no matter what, and they won't help us to massacre our own people if it ever comes to it. And ever since then, you've had them trying to do things like the whole attempt to pivot to China and increasingly strike trade deals with the Far East in order to have a second guarantor of security. They brought Russia in Syria, and they tried to build a relationship there, but Russia isn't as powerful as the West. And then the Trump years came along, and you had they invested very heavily in Donald Trump because they thought this was an opportunity to roll back the clock. You had all of those stories about Mohammed bin Salman's incredibly close relationship with the son-in-law,
Jared Kushner.
Yeah, and then the Khashoggi murder, which was for a lot of relationships the final nail in the coffin. People are still unable to roll that back. So now you have Joe Biden, the US president, still refusing to meet Mohammed bin Salman since his election. And all signs are that Mohammed bin Salman has taken this extremely personally. He's very deeply offended by it and even outraged. He wants to be legitimized by the US president. He wants to shake his hand. He wants everyone to see that he can stand on an equal platform with him. And what we've been seeing, particularly in the disinformation output, is that MBS sees a lot of what's happening right now not as a strategic matter for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but as a personal matter and as some score settling.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point that I think I haven't seen many people discuss it, but from our analysis and certainly from our really our information about who Mohammed bin Salman is, and really this is something that kind of explains his behavior to a large extent. This is for him not really about the strategy, but about the snub. He feels almost personally insulted by this kind of excommunication. He's basically treated in many circles as a pariah. He's not welcomed, for example, in the White House. Biden, whenever Biden wants to speak, he speaks to his father, to King Salman, rather than to Mohammed bin Salman. And we've seen that in many cases, this thing that's happening right now with this, trying to twist America's arm into normalizing some kind of gesture of normalizing MBS. You might think, okay, this guy has a strategy, but the strategy doesn't make sense. We can even talk more about why it doesn't make sense because it's so short term focused. But I think it's really we have to really consider that Mohammed bin Salman is not a disciplined actor, and for him this is really about the snub. What's really interesting here is that Mohammed bin Salman does not understand the world. He doesn't understand how the world works, and he doesn't understand soft power. So he's trying to twist the arm of the world into normalizing relations with him. But this is exactly why he's so reviled. I mean, the reason why he's reviled is because he thinks that he can force things to happen because he has money and power and because he has oil. I don't think MBS has really understood that he cannot be rehabilitated. He's still continuously trying to do a reset of 2018 when he was like his PR image was like so impeccable, especially on March 2018 when he made this highly publicized visit to the United States, and he was treated as a hero, received as a hero. It's come to the point where whoever engages him becomes problematic. Like if a politician or a businessman embrace MBS, they themselves are delegitimized. They're stigmatized. I don't think he fully grasped this, and maybe one of the things that really one incident recently that we actually tracked on disinformation, but also off that, is the whole interview with the Atlantic. Maybe you can give a rundown of that.
So at the start of March, the Atlantic magazine ran this really high-profile interview with MBS by Graham Wood, and it was basically a very sympathetic interview that let him use all of the standard lines that he likes to use, like being a reformer of a stubbornly pre-modern kingdom. He got to use his line about seeing Israel as a potential ally, not as a friend, which is, I guess, very logical if they're a potential ally in crushing civil society. He got to emphasize Saudi Arabia's commitment to the OPEC Plus framework for stabilizing global energy prices, and OPEC Plus means OPEC plus Russia. So this is a few days into the Russian war on Ukraine, and he's basically signaling that Russia are still our friends and don't expect us to cut ties with them. And this a very softball interview, which, talked about the failure of democracy in the Arab region and basically let him set himself up as the only alternative. His disinformation networks immediately ran with this. Thousands of fake accounts on Twitter posting quotes and excerpts. Only the thing is, a lot of these quotes and excerpts were distorted or they were completely fabricated. And the author of the piece, Graham Wood, noticed, and he tried to clarify it, and he basically got mobbed by the disinformation networks. He was abused by them. He was, called names, and he was threatened.
I mean, this is MBS thinking that, hey, I got this high-profile interview that's going to change, public perception of me. And then the person who interviewed him himself comes out and say, no, you're kind of stretching, this is not really what this is about. And so his disinformation engine, MBS's disinformation engine, that was kind of making a big deal about this interview, suddenly started attacking the very journalist who sat with him.
Yeah, and we thought it was a very softball interview. He got to say everything he wanted and he was, barely challenged. But MBS reads this interview and thinks this isn't good enough.
Yeah.
I only got 98% of the narrative.
Yeah, but that's the thing. That's what I mean when I say he doesn't understand how the world works, and he still thinks that he can twist someone's arm into becoming, kind of getting back his PR image and his image as a reformer, and everyone is going to love him again, or that he's going to that even when he gets, like you said, like a kind of a softball interview, buy it somehow, if I just get the right interview or hire the right lobbyist. And I mean, he's just not getting it. But it was really interesting to see that he still messes it up. It's still not getting into his head. I do want to kind of pivot back to something that you mentioned earlier because it's also important. Which kind of carries the same, and I think this is something that's also echoed in a piece that was written recently by Khalid Al-Jabri. I think it was written in Foreign Policy magazine. Argument that you gave, which is that it's not that these countries, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, doubt America's protection of security guarantee. America is still committed to the survival of the Saudi state and the survival of the Emirati state for strategic reasons, geopolitics. Is not going to protect you in the way that Putin protected Bashar al-Assad. Let's put it that way, because Bashar al-Assad, for political reasons, etc. What they doubt, these regimes doubt, is the protection model. So the United States events since 2011. If you are an Arab dictator and you saw 2011 and you saw what happened to Saleh of Yemen, to Mubarak in Egypt, a lot of these people, if you're an Arab dictator and Ahmed, earlier you walked us through if the shit hits the fan, if it comes down to that, I want to be Egypt, to Gaddafi in Libya, and then to Bashar al-Assad. You're like, Bashar al-Assad is my role model. This is how Bashar al-Assad, I want to be the guy who survives. Even slaughters, massacres, whatever, but I want to be the guy who survives. So in a sense, this Putin-Assad relationship is nowhere Assad relationship. And this is whatever criticisms we have of America, America's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE is not going to be a Putin. This is the thing. I mean, this is why they still want. We want to be friends with the West because the West provides these security guarantees, etc. But also, if things get really bad, then it's not the West that will save us. It's someone like Putin. It's someone like of course, they're also trying to reach out to China, but China's not. There's no in that sense. There's no applicable model for China because China is again, it's mercantilist. It's not exactly it's not an expansionist. So this is really interesting because it does change. I mean, it does add another dimension to the relationship. But also one of the things that also happened post 2011 is really this reconfiguration of the security of the region, and we have seen this kind of rise of rivalry with I mean, of course, especially in the past few years, where you have this rise of rivalry between a Saudi UAE and increasingly Saudi UAE Israeli axis with this Iranian axis. There's also countries like Qatar, for example, who are kind of like walking a fine line in between. It's not so much an ally of Iran, but it's also, an adversary to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And something really important happened with the current crisis in Ukraine, and this oil, this energy crisis that came with it, and because keep in mind, what just happened, and this oil crunch has really made countries. So of course, let's say that you're Saudi Arabia, and this kind of happens, and you immediately tell America and Western countries, we got this. Don't go speak to the Iranians, don't speak to the Venezuelans, don't speak to the Qataris. We got this. We're going to stabilize oil demand. But this is not what MBS did. What MBS did is like, no, I'm going to price gouge. As a result of that, and it was really only after that, and after this, as part of this frustration, that you saw America kind of trying to rush through the Iran deal, trying to basically get Iranian oil on the market as soon as possible, trying to get Venezuelan oil on the market. And you've seen also Qatar's position being kind of upgraded because Qatar, of course, again, it's a major supplier of gas, and you've seen basically I think Germany sign an important trade deal when it comes to energy supply, LNG supply from Qatar. So in a sense, MBS, he kind of got his former friends, who used to be his closest allies, to start to reach out even more, to become even more warm, or at least more accommodating for his enemies, which is exactly the opposite of what he needs. I do want to mention as well, I mean, before handing it to you, Ahmed, a lot of what we're talking about right now, this, how this is basically short-term, he's basically trading off short-term gain for like real problems on the long term, is something that actually was mentioned, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, in an interview by Hillary Clinton. And again, we've seen the Saudi disinformation network jump on that and, call her all sorts of names. Because again, I mean, the whole thing's like, how dare you say this? It's like, there's no strategic sense there to say, what, maybe we should actually respond in a strategic way. No, it's all basically, MBS doesn't like this.
So we've been saying this for years, but MBS may only be the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He remains the king of self-owns. Jamal Khashoggi was a self-inflicted wound on his global reputation. So was his closeness to Trump and Jared Kushner. And the Iran deal was floundering, and he probably gave it the biggest push to get it over the finish line. Nobody else could have done that. It was really him refusing to turn on the oil taps that enabled that to happen. So he just keeps on inflicting self-inflicted wound after self-inflicted wound, and staggering onwards to do more. And it's really amazing how nobody's managed to stop this man yet, because he's harming the interests of his own country in the long term.
And keep in mind, by the way, I mean, he is actually deluded. I mean, keep in mind, he really believes he's a superpower. I mean, he actually feels like he's the king of the world right now. I mean, you're calling him the king of self-owned. He actually believes that he's the king of the world right now, and he surrounded himself with people who reinforce this. Surrounded himself with the yes men, which is kind of something I was thinking about yesterday. How what's happening with Putin in Ukraine? I mean, this failure of Russia. This kind of catastrophic situation they have, of course, catastrophic for Ukraine, but also catastrophic for Russia, for Putin's hold on power. Doesn't it show what a bad and terrible? I mean, forget dictatorship as a governance system. Doesn't it show how bad dictatorship is as a management system? I mean, you don't truth doesn't flow to you, so you can't make decisions, and so you end up taking really, really bad decisions. We've seen it in Putin, who was supposed to be, his regime is supposed to be a lot more shrewd and more, strategic and more powerful than something like Saudi Arabia, and we're seeing it again in Saudi Arabia as well.
Yeah, I think the Putin one is another one that shocked people in just how terrible it was when this invasion happened, which, preparations have been happening very clearly and visibly for over 6 months. You could see it from satellites, and the US intelligence community was leaking expectations every few weeks about what he was going to do and when he was going to invade. And then when it did happen, it was so woefully underprepared, so under-equipped. Supply chains were so unready to deal with the invasion that it's floundered to a halt against a much smaller opponent. And there's still, questions over: does Putin actually know how bad it's going? Is the information reaching him, or are the people insulating him from it? How bad is the army organized? Because clearly money has been spent on it, but that money is disappearing somewhere without the actual end equipment being purchased. And we're seeing the same thing across Saudi Arabia's government.
Yeah, and I want to pivot from this point towards looking at the future. I mean, if we part of what we've said, and part of this entire analysis, really saying that this is trading off short-term gain, even questionable gain, for long-term problems. If we want to look at the long-term problems, what are they? To me, it's really that the next time a crisis comes along, and of course, as you mentioned, Ukraine is kind of a self-inflicted wound on Putin. Saudi Arabia, is going through a very difficult transition, and it is in a very, the whole region really is going through a very traumatic transition, and crises are going to come. The next time a crisis comes, we're going to see a lot of these unsustainabilities and those short-term thinking and this kind of trade-offs and this kind of gambling mentality kind of really come to a head. And it's interesting what you mentioned with the corruption in the Russian army, because this is something that kind of was a hidden problem. It exists, but it doesn't really become a serious problem until there's a war. Similarly, if you just kind of think how many unsustainabilities exist in these countries that are hidden because there's no crisis. And once a crisis hits, that's when when there's serious difficulty and there's all of this resentment comes in, all of this everything that they have created to kind of harm themselves on the long term is going to catch up with them sooner or later.
Well, that's what we've always said about these regional dictatorships, that they always look extremely stable, and until very suddenly they collapse entirely. The peak of the Mubarak regime's stability, arguably, was in late 2010. That's when it looked like he'd erased all domestic opposition. There hadn't been any notable challenge to him in years. He was, extremely secure on top of that pyramid, which suddenly turned out to have no foundations just a couple of months later. And it's really short-sighted not to think that MBS is doing this in Saudi Arabia right now.
Absolutely. So I do want to mention something. I think we're coming to the end of our analysis, but I do want to mention something, which is that I've seen some Saudi opposition figures actually praise MBS for this attempt to maximize oil profit. The whole point, of course, is that this is good. This is our country showing leadership, showing strength, and yes, why shouldn't we make more profit, get more money out of oil? Of course, keep in mind these are anti-MBS people. These are people who are opposition figures, and I have two things to tell them. The first is that this money is not going to the Saudi people. This money is going to MBS, and it's just going to make it easier for him to arrest your friends, assault you, demolish your neighborhoods, build a bigger PR engine, hack you, and bomb Yemen. This is not going to. It's not something to celebrate when a dictator becomes more wealthy. But also keep in mind all of the above. I mean, in the end, we are. I mean, as Arab Spring activists or Arab democracy activists, we don't want the collapse of the Saudi state or the Emirati state. I mean, we are opposed to these regimes. But we have no delusions about how catastrophic it would be if these states collapse. We've seen what the collapse of one state, Syria, has unleashed on the world. This is not because we want these countries world, and we don't want to see that. I mean, ultimately, the reason why we oppose these figures, threats to these nations destroyed. It's because we want these countries to thrive, and because we see these dictatorships as threats to these societies.
So I think we'll call it a day there, but there's an obvious place this conversation can continue, and that's the same divergence with the West happening with Israel right now, and we'll pick that up next time.
Absolutely. I've always felt that, what's happening right now with Israel not being, for the first time, not being geopolitically aligned with the West is also worth an entire conversation. It might even end up being an even longer conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast. Episodes are currently releasing every other Friday, so if you're listening to this on release, catch you in another 2 weeks. If you're looking for something sooner than that, then check out our new podcast, Intergalactic Tarbush. It's a weekly short-form podcast where we talk about random things from social change in the public sphere to why Iyad hates koalas so much. You can support us by leaving us a review on whichever app you listen to your podcasts on, or giving us a like on YouTube. You can also support us on Patreon, where our audience support plays a massive role in making sure our team at Kawakibi Foundation can keep doing what we do. Catch you next time.
ويا زمانا سيأتي يمحو الزمان المزيف